Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, but for Alexander James Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants who had sacrificed everything for the American dream, that turn came on an unusually warm October morning in the prestigious halls of the Boston Federal Courthouse. His story would soon become legendary in legal circles, shared in whispers through law school corridors, and debated in ethics classes for years to come. The morning fog still clung to the massive courthouse windows, creating an almost mystical barrier between the world of ordinary citizens and the realm of justice that lay within. The building itself stood as a testament to authority, its limestone facade weathered by decades of witnessing human drama unfold within its walls. Today, it would witness something unprecedented. Alexander, or AJ as his friends called him, represented far more than just another case number in Judge Richard Harrison's courtroom. His pristine academic record, including early acceptance to Harvard Medical School, perfect SAT scores, and countless hours of community service at local homeless shelters, made him the pride of Brighton High School. But none of that mattered now. The events of the past 3 months had systematically dismantled the careful plans he and his family had built over 17 years. In the public gallery, the usual morning crowd of lawyers, defendants, and curious onlookers had swelled to unusual numbers. Word had spread quickly through the legal community about the case of the prodigy student whose future hung by a thread. The gallery seats filled with spectators, including 3 local news reporters, their presence adding to the already suffocating pressure in the room. Ming Chen, AJ's mother, sat in the front row, her traditional qipao dress a stark contrast to the sea of dark suits surrounding her. Her fingers moved ceaselessly over her mother's jade pendant, a nervous habit she had developed since the nightmare began. Beside her sat David Chen, AJ's father, a respected cardiovascular surgeon whose own journey from a poor village in Fujian province to Harvard Medical School had inspired his son's dreams. The irony that their son now faced judgment in a courthouse rather than preparing to follow his father's footsteps was almost too much to bear. Alexander James Chen, or AJ as he preferred, was a child of contrasts. His world had always been a delicate balance between the disciplined expectations of his Chinese immigrant parents and the liberating, often overwhelming reality of growing up in America. The Chens had left behind their rural village in Fujian province, carrying nothing but dreams of a better future and a determination forged in hardship. For AJ, this determination became both a blessing and a burden. From a young age, AJ understood that his parents' sacrifices demanded extraordinary effort in return. His father, David Chen, a self-made cardiovascular surgeon, had often recounted stories of studying by candlelight after long days working in the fields. "If I could do it with nothing, you can do it with everything," he would say, his voice both inspiring and unyielding. AJ's mother, Ming, reinforced this ethos, often reminding him of the value of discipline and honor. Yet, for all their love and guidance, the weight of their expectations was immense. As an only child, AJ bore the full brunt of his parents' aspirations. His schedule was packed with advanced placement courses, extracurricular activities, and countless hours volunteering at community shelters. On paper, AJ thrived, an impeccable GPA, leadership roles in student government, and accolades in state-level science fairs. But beneath the surface, the pressure began to take its toll. Self-doubt crept in during middle school, as AJ started comparing himself to his peers. While his achievements were remarkable, they often felt like obligations rather than passions. He struggled to reconcile his parents' vision of success with his own identity. AJ found solace in books and music, losing himself in the works of authors who grappled with identity and belonging. These brief escapes offered comfort, but couldn't erase the gnawing anxiety that accompanied every exam, every piano recital, and every speech competition. The societal pressures AJ faced were no less daunting. Growing up in Brighton, a predominantly white suburb, he often felt out of place. Despite his accomplishments, AJ couldn't shake the feeling that he was seen more as a stereotype than as an individual. Teachers praised him as the model minority. Classmates turned to him for help in math and science, and even strangers made assumptions about his future. These interactions, though often well-meaning, left him feeling boxed in, his individuality overshadowed by expectations rooted in cultural bias. The challenges didn't stop there. AJ's early teens were marked by a deep personal loss that would shape his outlook on life. At 13, he lost his maternal grandmother, his Nai, who had lived with them since his birth. Nai had been AJ's confidant, the one person who never pressured him to succeed, but instead encouraged him to find joy in the small moments. Her passing left a void that no achievement could fill. For months, AJ withdrew into himself, his once bright energy dulled by grief. Amid these struggles, AJ also faced the isolation that came with being the perfect student. While his classmates attended parties and joined sports teams, AJ spent his weekends at academic competitions or shadowing his father at the hospital. This relentless pursuit of excellence left little room for friendships or hobbies, and AJ often found himself watching from the sidelines as others enjoyed the carefree experiences of adolescence. Despite these challenges, AJ refused to let his struggles define him. He poured himself into his community, finding purpose in tutoring underprivileged students and organizing food drives. These moments reminded him of Nai's wisdom and gave him glimpses of a life beyond rigid expectations. But even in these small victories, the weight of perfection loomed large. By the time AJ reached his senior year of high school, he had mastered the art of projecting confidence. His teachers adored him, his peers respected him, and his parents beamed with pride. Yet, behind closed doors, AJ wrestled with the constant fear of failure. He worried not only about disappointing his family, but also about losing himself in the process of meeting everyone else's expectations. As AJ sat in the Boston federal courthouse on that fateful October morning, the memories of his upbringing flooded his mind. He thought of the long nights spent poring over textbooks, the mornings practicing piano while his friends played basketball, and the quiet moments of grief that shaped his resilience. He thought of the countless times he had doubted himself, and the few precious times he had dared to dream beyond the expectations placed upon him. AJ's life had been anything but easy, but it had prepared him for this moment. As he sat nervously awaiting the judge's ruling, he realized that his story was far from over. No matter what happened, AJ knew one thing for certain. He had come too far and fought too hard to let this moment define him. The events that led Alexander James Chen to the Boston Federal Courthouse began with what should have been a mundane summer afternoon. It was mid-July, and AJ was riding his bike home from the community center after a long day of tutoring students. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Brighton, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. AJ, tired but content, had been replaying the words of a student who had just thanked him for making math finally make sense. For a fleeting moment, he felt that the sacrifices and pressures he endured were worth it. But life has a way of unraveling when you least expect it. As AJ rounded the corner of a suburban street, he heard the blare of a car horn behind him. Startled, he swerved slightly and lost control of his bike, skidding onto a perfectly manicured lawn. The bike collided with a low stone wall surrounding the property, sending AJ tumbling onto the grass. Scraped and shaken, he picked himself up and examined the bike, relieved to find only minor damage. The house belonged to Brighton's prominent real estate mogul, Everett Winslow, a man known for his wealth and influence in the community. Before AJ could even apologize or explain, Winslow emerged from the house, his face contorted with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice carrying across the pristine neighborhood. AJ stammered an apology, trying to explain that it had been an accident, but Winslow wasn't interested in explanations. He demanded AJ leave immediately, calling him reckless and irresponsible. AJ complied, walking his bike home with trembling hands. He thought that was the end of it, A frustrating encounter, but nothing more. However, 2 weeks later, AJ and his family received a summons to court. Winslow had accused AJ of vandalizing his property, claiming damages that were wildly exaggerated. The once minor scrape on the stone wall had, according to Winslow, become a deliberate act of destruction, complete with a repair bill that far exceeded anything AJ's family could afford. The accusation shocked AJ and his parents. His father, David Chen, was furious at the injustice, but AJ's mother, Ming, was terrified. She knew Winslow's reputation in the community and the weight his words carried. The Chens debated how to proceed, but AJ, feeling both anger and a sense of responsibility, insisted on facing the charges. "I didn't do anything wrong," he told his parents firmly. "I won't let him ruin us over a lie." The lead-up to the court date was a whirlwind of stress and confusion. The Chens, unfamiliar with legal proceedings, scrambled to find a lawyer who could represent them against Winslow's aggressive legal team. AJ's parents dug into their savings to cover the initial fees, but the cost of defending themselves quickly mounted. AJ blamed himself for the financial strain, though his parents reassured him that none of this was his fault. As word of the case spread, it quickly became a topic of discussion in Brighton. Winslow's supporters framed AJ as a careless teenager who needed to be taught a lesson, while others questioned why a wealthy man would pursue such a harsh response over a minor incident. The media picked up on the story, and headlines like "Brighton prodigy faces legal battle against real estate tycoon" only added to the pressure. AJ found himself in the uncomfortable spotlight, his achievements now overshadowed by the pending case. In the weeks leading up to the trial, AJ struggled to balance his responsibilities. He spent his days preparing for his senior year, volunteering at the community center, and helping his parents navigate the legal process. At night, he lay awake, replaying the incident in his mind. The memory of Winslow's anger and the feeling of helplessness gnawed at him. Despite his confidence in the truth, AJ couldn't shake the fear of what might happen in the courtroom. He knew that the odds were stacked against him. Winslow's resources, influence, and reputation gave him an undeniable advantage. By the time the court date arrived, AJ was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As he stepped into the courtroom that October morning, the gravity of the situation hit him fully. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about repairing a wall or paying a fine. It was about preserving his future and protecting his family from a powerful man who seemed determined to destroy their hard-earned stability. The nervous energy in the courtroom was palpable as AJ sat beside his lawyer, avoiding eye contact with Winslow's smirking face across the room. AJ's parents sat behind him, their presence both comforting and heartbreaking. Ming clutched her jade pendant while David's hands rested stiffly on his lap. AJ could feel their silent prayers for strength, but he also felt the immense weight of their expectations. As the judge entered the room and the trial began, AJ took a deep breath. He reminded himself of the truth, that he had done nothing wrong, and that he was standing up not just for himself, but for everything his family had sacrificed to build. Little did he know, the day would unfold in ways no one could have predicted, leaving the courtroom and its occupants forever changed. Alexander James Chen was no stranger to adversity, but what set him apart wasn't just his ability to endure, it was his quiet resilience, a strength rooted in determination and self-awareness. Over the years, AJ had developed a way of processing challenges that allowed him to adapt, think critically, and rise above even the most daunting obstacles. One of AJ's defining traits was his sharp intellect, not just in academics but in understanding people and situations. He had a keen sense of observation, often picking up on subtleties others missed. This ability made him an excellent tutor at the community center, where he tailored his lessons to each student's learning style. Parents often marveled at his patience and ingenuity, but for AJ, helping others was second nature. He believed in the power of knowledge and understood that it was often the best tool for overcoming life's challenges. His intelligence extended beyond the classroom. A.J. had a natural talent for strategy, something he often applied in his volunteer work and leadership roles. As the president of his school's debate team, he had learned how to construct compelling arguments, anticipate counterpoints, and present his case with clarity and confidence. These skills, though honed in academic settings, reflected a deeper strength, a belief in standing firm for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. A.J.'s resilience was also evident in how he handled the immense pressure from his family and peers. Despite the expectations placed upon him, he never let them define his self-worth. He had faced his share of setbacks, moments when a test score wasn't perfect or when he felt like he wasn't living up to his parents' high standards, but each time, he found a way to move forward. His ability to balance these pressures without losing sight of his own identity was a quiet act of defiance against the crushing weight of perfectionism. Another aspect of A.J.'s strength lay in his empathy. His grandmother, Nai Nai, had instilled in him a deep appreciation for kindness and connection. She often told him that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. This lesson shaped how A.J. interacted with the world. Even in the face of adversity, he remained compassionate, refusing to let anger or bitterness consume him. It was this empathy that gave him the courage to stand up for himself and others, even when it felt easier to back down. In the days leading up to the trial, these qualities became more apparent. A.J. pored over the details of his case with meticulous care, working closely with his lawyer to ensure they were prepared for every argument Winslow's team might present. He approached the situation like a puzzle to be solved, combining logic with emotional intelligence to navigate the complexities of the legal system. Though he felt the weight of the stakes, he didn't let fear dictate his actions. When the courtroom doors opened that October morning, A.J. stepped inside with a quiet resolve. His nerves were undeniable, but so was his determination. He knew he couldn't control what the judge or Winslow might do, but he could control how he responded. He carried with him the lessons he had learned from his parents, his grandmother, and his own experiences. Lessons that had taught him to face challenges not with arrogance, but with dignity and strength. A.J.'s silent strength was his ability to stand tall in the face of injustice, to speak his truth with conviction, and to remain true to himself no matter the outcome. These qualities would come to define not just his defense, but the impact he would leave on everyone in that courtroom. Judge Richard Harrison was a figure who commanded attention the moment he entered a courtroom. Known for his impeccable suits, stern demeanor, and sharp intellect, he had built a reputation as one of the most respected legal minds in the state. Appointed to the federal bench after decades of successful litigation, Harrison was revered by colleagues, feared by litigants, and frequently discussed in legal circles for his no-nonsense approach to justice. Harrison's reputation was rooted in his firm belief in the law as an unyielding standard. To him, the courtroom was not just a venue for disputes, but a sacred space where truth prevailed, and justice was delivered without compromise. He saw himself as the embodiment of this ideal, a guardian of order in a world too often tainted by chaos. Lawyers often joked nervously that you didn't argue in Harrison's courtroom, you survived it. His rulings were meticulous, his reasoning unassailable. Law journals regularly cited his decisions, praising their clarity and adherence to precedent. Among his peers, Harrison was considered a rising star, someone who might one day ascend to the circuit court or even higher. Legal conferences sought him as a speaker, and law students studied his opinions with the same reverence they reserved for Supreme Court justices. Outside the courtroom, Harrison projected an image of discipline and authority. He was a regular guest at elite social functions, his presence always marked by a quiet charisma. Though not particularly warm, he carried an air of respectability that made people want to impress him. His speeches at law school graduations were often quoted, filled with calls to uphold the dignity of the legal profession and respect for the rule of law. But Harrison's no-nonsense demeanor also came with a sharp edge. While many admired his command of the courtroom, Others found him intimidating or even cruel. His questioning of witnesses was often pointed to the point of humiliation, and his quick temper left little room for error. Attorneys who failed to meet his exacting standards often left his courtroom feeling defeated, their arguments dismissed with biting sarcasm. "Come back when you understand the law," he had once told a junior lawyer, a comment that quickly spread through legal circles. In high-profile cases, Harrison's conduct was closely scrutinized. While his rulings were rarely overturned, his courtroom manner sparked debates. Supporters argued that his strictness was necessary to maintain order and uphold justice. Critics, however, accused him of arrogance, claiming that his approach discouraged open discourse and perpetuated an atmosphere of fear rather than respect. Despite these criticisms, Harrison remained a towering figure in the legal community. His courtroom was a stage, and he was its undisputed star. Whether admired or feared, one thing was certain. When Judge Harrison presided, every word, every glance, and every decision carried weight. He was a man who thrived on control, and in his mind, he believed this control was necessary to ensure the integrity of the law. However, for all his authority and brilliance, Harrison was not immune to human flaws. His quick temper and unyielding demeanor often masked a deeper insecurity, a need to prove himself in a world that constantly demanded perfection. In AJ's case, Harrison would soon find himself at the center of a moment that would test his ideals and expose the vulnerabilities beneath his formidable exterior. Little did he know, the very traits that had made him a celebrated judge would also set the stage for one of the most challenging moments of his career. Judge Richard Harrison's reputation for a no-nonsense approach often bordered on outright disdain for those who failed to meet his exacting expectations. While his colleagues lauded his intellect and adherence to the law, those who appeared before him frequently left his courtroom feeling humiliated and defeated. His sharp tongue, combined with an unrelenting insistence on precision, turned even routine proceedings into a gauntlet of scrutiny. Defendants in particular bore the brunt of Harrison's severity. To him, the courtroom was a place of order, and anyone who disrupted that order, whether intentionally or out of ignorance, was subject to his wrath. Harrison had little patience for nervous stammering, emotional outbursts, or perceived incompetence. In his view, such behavior was a sign of disrespect for the sanctity of the law. It wasn't uncommon for Harrison to interrupt a defendant mid-sentence, his voice laced with sarcasm as he cut through their words like a knife. "Let me stop you right there," he would say, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you're trying to earn my sympathy, you're wasting everyone's time. Stick to the facts, assuming you know them." His words often left defendants fumbling for their thoughts, their confidence shattered under the weight of his gaze. Harrison's courtroom demeanor was particularly harsh toward those he perceived as unprepared or beneath the standards he expected. Young defendants, individuals representing themselves, or those from disadvantaged backgrounds often found themselves on the receiving end of his scorn. He viewed their nervousness as incompetence and their mistakes as carelessness. To him, there was no excuse for ignorance of the law, even for those without the resources or education to fully navigate it. One particularly infamous incident involved a middle-aged single mother representing herself in a small claims case. As she nervously attempted to explain her side, Harrison interrupted her multiple times, demanding that she speak clearly and coherently. When she stumbled over legal terminology, he remarked, "If you don't know the difference between a claim and a counterclaim, perhaps you shouldn't be wasting this court's time." The woman left the courtroom in tears, her case dismissed with little explanation. Lawyers, too, were not immune to Harrison's harsh methods. While some relished the challenge of arguing before him, others dreaded his courtroom, knowing that even a minor misstep could result in public embarrassment. Harrison often used their mistakes as teachable moments, though not for their benefit. "Counselor," he would say with a sigh, "do you even understand the case law you just cited? Or are we playing a game of legal darts hoping something will stick?" Critics argued that Harrison's style created an atmosphere of fear rather than justice. They pointed out that his relentless sarcasm and dismissive attitude discouraged defendants from fully engaging with the process, leaving them feeling voiceless in a system already stacked against them. Supporters, however, defended his methods as a necessary means of maintaining courtroom discipline. They argued that Harrison's sharpness weeded out frivolous arguments and ensured that proceedings remained efficient and focused. For Harrison, his harsh methods were a source of pride, a reflection of his belief in the law's authority. Yet his behavior often betrayed an underlying bias, a tendency to equate nervousness with incompetence and lack of polish with lack of merit. Defendants who didn't fit his image of a credible litigant often faced harsher scrutiny, their words dismissed before they even had a chance to make their case. This pattern became particularly evident in cases involving young people. Harrison saw them as reckless and entitled, a generation that he believed lacked the discipline and respect that had defined his own upbringing. He often dismissed their nervousness as an act, their stammering as an excuse, and their tears as manipulation. "You think life is hard now?" he once told a teenage defendant. "Wait until the real world gets hold of you. If you can't handle a courtroom, you won't survive out there." In AJ's case, Harrison's disdain for youth and his bias toward authority figures like Everett Winslow created a perfect storm. The prodigy teen with a promising future was, in Harrison's eyes, just another nervous young defendant making excuses. He barely glanced at AJ's accomplishments or character references, focusing instead on the minor scrape to Winslow's property as a symbol of carelessness. AJ's visible anxiety only reinforced Harrison's perception that he was incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. What Harrison didn't realize, however, was that AJ's silence and nervous demeanor concealed a resilience far greater than he anticipated. The judge's harsh methods, intended to intimidate, would soon serve as the catalyst for a response that no one in the courtroom could have predicted. In his relentless pursuit of control, Harrison had unwittingly set the stage for a moment that would challenge not just his authority, but his understanding of justice itself. Behind Judge Richard Harrison's imposing facade lay insecurities that he would never admit, even to himself. His courtroom persona of unyielding authority and sharp intellect was carefully constructed, a shield against the doubts that occasionally crept into his mind. Though he had risen to prominence in the legal field, Harrison often felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him, a reminder that even the slightest misstep could tarnish his reputation. Harrison's strict upbringing played a significant role in shaping his insecurities. The son of a stern military officer and a schoolteacher, he grew up in a household where discipline and achievement were paramount. His father's constant refrain, "Weakness is failure," had instilled in him a fear of vulnerability, one he carried into adulthood. This fear drove his relentless pursuit of perfection, but also left him deeply uncomfortable with any display of emotion, whether in himself or others. Though Harrison outwardly projected confidence, he was acutely aware of the whispers among his peers and critics. Some accused him of lacking empathy, of prioritizing order over justice. These criticisms stung, though he buried the pain beneath layers of justification. He told himself that his methods were necessary, that maintaining control was the only way to uphold the dignity of the law. "Speak up," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "We can't hear you if you mumble." The judge's words stung, and AJ swallowed hard, fighting the urge to shrink under the weight of his reprimand. He raised his voice slightly, repeating his name with as much steadiness as he could muster. As the questioning began, AJ struggled to find his footing. Ms. Carver's questions were straightforward, designed to allow him to explain what had happened, but each word felt like an uphill climb. His answers were halting, his voice wavering as he recounted the events of that summer day. I was riding my bike home," he began, his eyes darting nervously between Ms. Carver and the judge. "I lost control and hit the wall. It was an accident." Harrison's expression remained stoic, though his sharp eyes seemed to pierce through AJ's words. An accident, the judge said, his voice laced with skepticism. You expect this court to believe that a simple accident caused the damage in question? AJ's throat tightened. He wanted to shout that it was the truth, that he wasn't lying, but the judge's tone made him second-guess himself. His confidence crumbled further as Winslow's lawyer rose for cross-examination. The lawyer's questions were pointed, designed to trip him up and cast doubt on his story. "Mr. Chen," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with condescension, "how exactly does one lose control of a bike on a straight road? Were you distracted? Perhaps texting?" "No," AJ said quickly, shaking his head. "I wasn't." "Then what were you doing?" the lawyer interrupted, his words sharp and unrelenting. "Daydreaming? Ignoring your surroundings? Surely a responsible young man like yourself wouldn't be so careless." AJ stammered, his mind racing for the right words. I just lost control. The car horn startled me and—" "A car horn startled you?" the lawyer repeated, his tone mocking. "So you're suggesting this was someone else's fault?" "No," AJ said, his voice rising in frustration. "I'm not blaming anyone. It happened so fast." The lawyer smirked, glancing toward the gallery as though to invite their amusement. "It just happened," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "That's convenient, isn't it?" AJ felt his face flush with heat. His hands clenched the edges of the stand, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to shout that he wasn't lying, but the words wouldn't come. The laughter and whispers from the gallery only deepened his humiliation, and his gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the noise. "Order," he said sharply, silencing the room, but his gaze returned to AJ, his expression one of thinly veiled disappointment. "If you want this court to believe your version of events, Mr. Chen, I suggest you start presenting yourself with some confidence. Right now, all I see is a nervous boy who doesn't seem to understand the gravity of this situation." The words hit AJ like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he felt himself sinking into despair. But somewhere deep within him, a spark began to flicker, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. The ridicule and doubt surrounding him were suffocating, but AJ knew that the truth was on his side. He wasn't sure how yet, but he resolved that he would find his voice. Little did the courtroom know, that moment was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. The courtroom felt colder than it had when AJ first stepped inside. The large windows, which earlier seemed to frame the sunlight in an almost divine glow, now cast long shadows across the room, mirroring the pit growing in AJ's stomach. He sat stiffly in the witness box, gripping the edge of the wooden stand as though it could anchor him in the storm brewing around him. The air was thick with judgment, and the piercing gaze of Judge Richard Harrison bore down on him like a hawk circling its prey. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him as his sharp eyes settled on AJ. "Well, Mr. Chen," he began, his tone smooth yet cutting, "this is quite the story you've brought before my courtroom today." AJ blinked, unsure if he was meant to respond. His heart pounded in his chest, so loud he could barely hear the judge's next words. "So, let me get this straight," Harrison continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You were simply riding your bike, minding your own business, and through some miraculous twist of fate, you managed to crash into Mr. Winslow's wall. Just like that. No distractions, no carelessness, just a perfect, unfortunate accident." AJ opened his mouth, desperate to explain, but his words caught in his throat. Harrison didn't give him the chance to speak anyway. "How convenient," the judge added, his lips curling into a faint, humorless smile. "It must be nice to live in a world where mistakes just happen, and no one is held accountable." The room was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. AJ could feel every pair of eyes in the room on him, their silent judgment suffocating. His cheeks burned as he glanced at the spectators. Some looked bored, others curious, and a few exchanged knowing glances, as if they had already decided the outcome. I must say, Mr. Chen, Harrison said, leaning forward slightly, his voice taking on an almost playful edge, this is one of the more creative excuses I've heard. Tell me, do you also believe that your intentions absolve you of responsibility? Or is this all part of the magical world you seem to inhabit? AJ's grip tightened on the edge of the stand. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it truly had been an accident, but the weight of Harrison's words pressed down on him like a boulder. Every time he tried to gather his thoughts, the judge's sharp tone sliced through them. "Let me educate you, Mr. Chen," Harrison said, straightening in his chair. "Responsibility is not about intentions. It's about actions and consequences. Mr. Winslow's property did not damage itself, did it?" "No, Your Honor," AJ replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Speak up," Harrison snapped. "This is a courtroom, not a library." AJ cleared his throat and repeated himself, his voice trembling. "No, Your Honor." Harrison nodded, though his expression was far from satisfied. "Good. Now let's talk about this so-called apology you claim to have offered. Did you make any effort to contact Mr. Winslow after the incident?" "I tried to, Your Honor," AJ said, his voice quivering, "but he didn't want to hear it." Harrison raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "He didn't want to hear it? How convenient for you. So you're saying this was all out of your hands?" AJ shook his head quickly. "No, that's not what I meant." "Then what do you mean, Mr. Chen?" Harrison interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're trying to shift the blame onto everyone but yourself." AJ froze, his mind racing. Every word he said seemed to make things worse. He glanced toward his lawyer, Ms. Carver, who gave him a small, encouraging nod, but even her calm presence couldn't quiet the storm of doubt raging inside him. "I don't think you fully grasp the gravity of this situation," Harrison continued, his tone growing colder. "This is not a classroom where you get points for effort. This is the real world, Mr. Chen. Mistakes have consequences. And right now, all I see is a nervous young man trying to wriggle out of those consequences with a story that doesn't add up." AJ's chest tightened as Harrison's words hung in the air. He wanted to shout that it wasn't a story, that he was telling the truth, but the judge's piercing gaze held him in place. He felt trapped, like a mouse cornered by a cat, its every movement scrutinized and mocked. From the gallery, AJ could hear faint whispers, followed by the muffled sound of someone stifling a laugh. His face burned, humiliation clawing at him as he fought to keep his composure. He lowered his eyes, staring at the wood grain of the stand as if it might offer some escape from the oppressive atmosphere. Harrison sighed heavily and shook his head. "This is why accountability matters," he said, addressing the room as though delivering a lecture. "When people refuse to take responsibility for their actions, we end up with situations like this, frivolous excuses and wasted time." AJ felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wouldn't let himself cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. Ms. Carver stood abruptly, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, my client is not refusing to take responsibility. He is simply trying to explain the circumstances as they occurred." Harrison raised a hand, silencing her. "Ms. Carver, I understand what your client is trying to do. The question is whether he understands what is expected of him in this courtroom." Ms. Carver sat down slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. AJ felt a pang of guilt. She had worked so hard to prepare him, and now it felt like he was letting her down. Harrison turned his attention back to AJ, his expression hard. "Now, Mr. Chen, I'll give you one more chance to present yourself as someone who understands the seriousness of this matter. Do you think you can manage that?" AJ nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Good," Harrison replied. "Then I suggest you start proving it." The room fell silent again, the tension thick and stifling. AJ sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Harrison's words had cut deep, but somewhere inside him, a flicker of defiance stirred. He knew he had the truth on his side, and he realized that if he didn't find the strength to speak up, no one else would do it for him. As the judge prepared to move on, A.J. straightened slightly in his chair. The humiliation he felt was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a new resolve. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew he would make his voice heard. And when he did, it would echo through the room in a way no one, not even Judge Harrison, could ignore. The courtroom hung in a suffocating silence as all eyes remained fixed on Alexander James Chen. Judge Harrison's sharp rebuke echoed in A.J.'s mind, each word replaying like a relentless drumbeat. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat as he gripped the edge of the witness stand for stability. The weight of the room pressed down on him, threatening to crush the last fragments of confidence he had left. The tension in the air was palpable. In the gallery, the spectators shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in anticipation. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by a single glare from Harrison. A.J.'s parents sat rigid in the front row, their faces etched with worry. Ming clutched her jade pendant tightly, her lips moving in what seemed like a silent prayer, while David's jaw tightened with every passing second. Their hope and fear combined into a single, tangible force that A.J. could feel radiating toward him. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of impatience and expectation. He folded his hands in front of him, his piercing gaze never leaving A.J. The judge's demeanor was calm, almost casual, but it carried an edge that hinted at a quiet enjoyment of the moment. Harrison thrived on control, and right now, A.J. was the embodiment of everything the judge relished, a young, inexperienced defendant teetering on the edge of collapse under his scrutiny. "Mr. Chen," Harrison said, his tone deliberately measured, "I am waiting. Surely, someone with your supposed intelligence and potential has something to say for himself." A.J.'s stomach twisted at the words. He could feel his anxiety threatening to overwhelm him, a tide rising too fast to hold back. His throat felt dry, his thoughts jumbled and scattered. He stared down at the wood grain of the witness stand, the intricate patterns blurred by the tears he refused to let fall. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Even the reporters, who had been scribbling notes furiously moments before, now sat motionless, their pens hovering above their notepads. A few of the spectators exchanged knowing glances, smirking as though they already knew how this would end. To them, A.J. was just another nervous teenager, out of his depth and about to crumble under the weight of his mistakes. Harrison tapped a finger against the armrest of his chair, the soft sound cutting through the stillness like a metronome counting down A.J.'s remaining time. "Any day now, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Or should we assume that silence is the best defense you can offer?" The judge's words stung, but something deep within A.J. stirred. It wasn't anger, though it burned faintly beneath the surface. It was a quiet, resolute determination that began to rise against the tide of doubt and fear. He had spent his entire life working to prove himself, to rise above the challenges and expectations placed upon him. And now, in this moment, he realized that his silence was not the answer. He had to speak. A.J. straightened in his seat, his grip on the witness stand loosening as he took a deep breath. His heart still pounded, but his hands steadied. The flicker of defiance in his chest began to grow, spreading warmth through his limbs. He glanced toward his parents, their worried faces a reminder of everything they had sacrificed for him. He thought of Nai Nai, her voice echoing in his memory, urging him to face challenges with courage. He lifted his gaze and met Harrison's eyes. The judge's expression remained stern, but A.J. didn't flinch. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like static electricity. A.J. opened his mouth, his voice low but steady as he prepared to say the words that would change everything. The silence before the storm stretched thin, each second a thread threatening to snap. The entire courtroom waited, some expecting him to falter, others hoping for something more. And in that fragile moment, A.J. found his voice. The courtroom was a still, tense tableau. Alexander James Chen sat motionless in the witness stand, his fingers curled tightly over the polished wood edge. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as he stared at the floor, trying to calm the storm of doubt raging inside him. The weight of Judge Richard Harrison's piercing gaze pressed down on him, relentless and unyielding. For a moment, AJ thought he might suffocate under it. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. His expression was one of thinly veiled disdain, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smirk. "Well, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice smooth but cutting, "you have taken up this court's time with your story. Now I suggest you find the courage to finish it. Or perhaps you would rather remain silent and let us draw our own conclusions." The room was so silent that AJ could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. The eyes of every spectator bore into him, their judgment unspoken but palpable. From the gallery, his mother sat on the edge of her seat, clutching her jade pendant so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Beside her, his father's jaw was tight, his composed demeanor betrayed only by the faint furrow of his brow. AJ knew what they were thinking. They wanted him to speak, to defend himself, to find the strength to push through this moment. But the judge's words hung over him like a storm cloud. They stung, sharp and dismissive, feeding the gnawing fear in his chest. He felt like he was shrinking under the weight of their expectations, his voice caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. Harrison shifted in his chair, his impatience evident in the slight tap of his fingers against the bench. "We are waiting, Mr. Chen," he said, his tone colder now. "Surely someone with your supposed intellect and potential can manage a response." The spark of defiance that had been buried under AJ's nerves began to flicker. Slowly, he lifted his head, his gaze meeting Harrison's. The judge's eyes were sharp and calculating, but AJ did not look away. He could feel his heart pounding, but instead of drowning in it, he allowed the rhythm to steady him. "Your Honor," AJ began, his voice low but clear. "I know this courtroom is no place for excuses. I am not here to offer one." The murmurs from the gallery stopped as abruptly as they had started. People leaned forward, their curiosity piqued by the shift in AJ's tone. Harrison arched an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but he gestured for AJ to continue. AJ took a slow, deliberate breath. "What I did that day caused damage. That is the truth. But it is also true that I didn't intend for it to happen. I was riding my bike home after tutoring at the community center. It is something I have done for years because I believe education can change lives. That belief comes from my parents. They taught me that if you work hard and give back, you can make a difference." He paused, his gaze sweeping briefly across the room. The courtroom was silent, every spectator hanging on his words. Even Harrison remained still, watching him with an intensity that made AJ's pulse quicken. "That day, I was tired," AJ continued, "but I felt good. I'd helped a student finally understand a concept they had been struggling with for weeks. For a moment, I forgot about all the pressure, all the expectations. I was just a kid riding home, proud of something I had done." He paused again, the memory flashing in his mind. The sound of the car horn still echoed in his ears, sharp and sudden. "Then I heard the horn. It startled me. I swerved, and before I knew it, I had lost control of my bike. I hit the wall." AJ's voice faltered slightly, but he steadied himself. "I got up immediately to check the damage. I knew I had to take responsibility, and I tried. I told Mr. Winslow I was sorry, that I would pay for the repairs or even fix it myself. But he didn't want to hear me. He told me to leave." His voice softened, tinged with frustration and sadness. "I left because I thought I had no other choice. Not because I didn't care, but because he refused to give me a chance to make it right." The gallery stirred again, and this time no one silenced the murmurs. AJ could feel the tide of judgment in the room beginning to shift, curiosity replacing skepticism. Harrison remained silent, his fingers now clasped tightly in front of him as he studied AJ with the intensity of a chess master considering his next move. AJ's voice grew firmer, steadier. "I know I am not perfect, Your Honor. I know that what happened caused harm, and I am ready to take responsibility for it. But I also believe that intent matters. I did not wake up that morning planning to damage someone's property. I woke up planning to help others, just like I try to do every day." His gaze met Harrison's once again, unwavering. "I hope that counts for something." The room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, AJ felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. He had spoken his truth, not with anger or defiance, but with the calm conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose but his integrity. The silence in the courtroom was no longer suffocating. It was electric, charged with the realization that something had shifted. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze never leaving AJ. The tension in his posture betrayed his thoughts. Whatever he had expected from this teenager, it had not been this. The gallery remained still, the spectators frozen as they waited for the judge to respond. AJ took a final breath, his hands finally relaxing at his sides. For the first time since the trial began, he felt as though he had reclaimed his voice. The weight of Alexander James Chen's words lingered in the courtroom like a ripple in still water, reaching every corner of the room and resonating with everyone present. For the first time that day, the stifled whispers and skeptical glances from the gallery faded, replaced by an intense, almost reverent silence. The courtroom, which moments before had been heavy with judgment and doubt, now felt transformed, charged with something different: reflection. Judge Richard Harrison leaned back in his chair, his sharp, calculating gaze fixed on AJ. His expression betrayed nothing, yet there was a subtle tension in the way he clasped his hands, the faintest furrow of his brow. AJ's words had struck a nerve, not just in their content, but in their delivery. Harrison had expected nervous stammering and shallow excuses, the kind he had heard countless times before from defendants who failed to understand the gravity of their situation. What he had received instead was a calm, heartfelt explanation that refused to crumble under pressure. AJ's final statement, "I hope that counts for something," seemed to echo in the judge's mind. It was a simple sentence, but one that carried an undeniable weight. Harrison's own biases, deeply ingrained and rarely challenged, suddenly felt exposed. The teenager sitting before him was not the careless, entitled youth he had initially assumed. Instead, AJ had shown himself to be thoughtful, principled, and willing to take responsibility, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Harrison's silence stretched for several moments, and in that pause, the gallery began to shift. Spectators who had come expecting a routine courtroom drama now found themselves captivated. Their initial judgment of AJ as a nervous boy floundering under pressure had softened. Many of them exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise and admiration. It was as though AJ's words had forced them to reconsider not just him, but the preconceived notions they had brought into the room. In the front row, Ming Chen wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, her grip on her jade pendant finally loosening. For weeks, she had worried that AJ's nerves would betray him, that the weight of everything, his upbringing, the expectations, the unfair accusations, would be too much for him to bear. But now, as she watched her son sit tall and steady in the witness stand, she felt an overwhelming swell of pride. This was the boy she had raised, not just intelligent and hard-working, but deeply empathetic and courageous. Beside her, David Chen exhaled slowly, his usually stoic demeanor softening. He didn't speak, but his hands unclenched, and the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He had always believed in AJ's potential, but seeing it manifest in this moment filled him with a quiet, unshakable confidence. In the gallery, the spectators' reactions varied. A few still clung to their initial skepticism, unwilling to let go of their assumptions so easily, but most of them were visibly moved. A middle-aged man in the back row, dressed in a worn suit, leaned forward, his arms resting on the bench in front of him. He had come to the courtroom out of curiosity, drawn by the sensationalism of a prodigy student on trial. Now, he found himself unexpectedly invested, his opinion of A.J. shifting with every word the teenager had spoken. Even the reporters, who had been scribbling notes furiously throughout the trial, paused to exchange glances. One of them, a young woman with sharp features and a notepad balanced on her knee, tapped her pen thoughtfully against her chin. She had expected to write about another courtroom humiliation, an all-too-common tale of youthful recklessness meeting well-deserved consequences. Instead, she realized, she might be witnessing a story about resilience, integrity, and the power of speaking truth to power. A.J.'s lawyer, Ms. Carver, sat a little straighter in her chair, her lips pressing together in what might have been a faint smile. She had believed in A.J. from the beginning, but even she had worried about how he would handle the pressure of cross-examination and the judge's sharp scrutiny. Now, as she watched him reclaim control of his narrative, she felt a surge of pride. A.J. wasn't just defending himself, he was challenging the very assumptions that had brought him to this point. Judge Harrison shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping against the armrest in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His mind raced as he replayed A.J.'s testimony, dissecting each word and its implications. He had spent years presiding over cases, sharpening his instincts to cut through excuses and posturing. Yet something about A.J.'s calm sincerity gave him pause. Harrison prided himself on his ability to read people, but for the first time in a long while he wondered if he had been too quick to judge. The boy's words, about taking responsibility, about intent and effort, struck a chord in Harrison that he hadn't expected. They reminded him of his own struggles as a young lawyer, fighting to prove himself in a world that seemed determined to dismiss him. He remembered the moments when he, too, had been judged unfairly, his efforts overlooked in favor of assumptions based on his demeanor or background. Harrison wasn't sure when he had stopped seeing those parallels in the people who came before him, but A.J.'s testimony brought them rushing back like an unwelcome tide. The room remained quiet as Harrison adjusted his posture, leaning forward slightly. He studied A.J., his eyes narrowing as though trying to find cracks in the teenager's resolve. But A.J. did not flinch. He met Harrison's gaze head-on, his shoulders squared and his chin held high. The judge's chest tightened, though he could not have said why. The gallery stirred again, a faint murmur rising among the spectators. Ming and David Chen exchanged a brief glance, their relief mirrored in each other's faces. Reporters began jotting down notes again, their pens moving quickly across their pads. A sense of anticipation filled the room, as though everyone present was waiting for something to break the tension that hung like a thick fog. A.J. remained still, his breathing even as he sat in the witness stand. His hands no longer trembled, and his voice had lost its earlier hesitation. He had done what he came to do. He had spoken his truth, not with anger or desperation, but with quiet conviction. For the first time, he felt like he had control over his own story, no longer defined by the assumptions of others. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," he said, his tone measured but lacking its earlier sharpness. "I have heard your explanation, and while this court will consider all the evidence, I must admit, your words have given me something to think about." The courtroom seemed to exhale as Harrison's words settled over the room. A.J. let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The battle was not over, but he had taken the first step in reclaiming his voice. And as the tension in the room began to ease, one thing became clear. His response had left a mark on everyone present. The moment would linger, not just in the courtroom, but in the minds of those who had witnessed it. A.J.'s words had not only challenged the assumptions against him, but had also revealed a deeper truth, that courage and integrity could shine through even the darkest moments, and that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most power. The courtroom was suspended in a state of stunned silence. Alexander James Chen had finished speaking, his final words hanging in the air like the echo of a bell that refused to fade. The stillness was so complete that the faint ticking of the clock on the back wall seemed unnaturally loud, each second stretching longer than the last. AJ sat in the witness stand, his shoulders straight but not stiff, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His gaze was steady, focused not on the judge or the gallery but somewhere in the middle distance, as if he was letting his words settle into the space around him. He didn't feel triumphant or defiant. He felt calm, as though he had finally stepped into his truth, no longer weighed down by the fear that had gripped him since the trial began. Judge Richard Harrison's face was unreadable at first. His eyes remained locked on A.J., his expression hard, as though carved from stone. But there was something different now, a crack in the impenetrable wall of his demeanor. His fingers, usually clasped in perfect composure, tapped absently against the armrest of his chair, betraying a subtle discomfort. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting for the briefest moment to the notes in front of him, then back to AJ. It was the first time anyone had seen the judge falter, even if only for a second. The gallery, packed with spectators who had come expecting an ordinary courtroom drama, sat frozen. Whispers that had previously buzzed like an undercurrent of judgment had disappeared entirely. People exchanged glances, their faces a mix of surprise, curiosity, and perhaps even guilt. The woman in the second row who had stifled a laugh earlier now sat with her arms crossed, her gaze cast downward. The man in the back who had been scribbling notes furiously now stared at A.J., his pen motionless in his hand. Ming Chen wiped a tear from her cheek, her jade pendant now cradled gently in her hands instead of being gripped tightly. She looked at her son with an expression that held equal parts pride and awe. David Chen sat beside her, his posture more relaxed than it had been all morning, though his eyes remained fixed on Judge Harrison, watching for any hint of what the judge might say or do next. The silence stretched on. Reporters in the back row shifted uncomfortably, their pens hovering over notepads as they debated whether it was appropriate to break the quiet. One young journalist glanced around, her sharp features softened by a look of genuine admiration for the teenager who had just transformed the atmosphere in the room. For Harrison, the silence was the loudest sound he had heard in years. AJ's words had stirred something in him, though he fought to suppress it. They had not only challenged the assumptions he had carried into the courtroom, but also forced him to confront the biases he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. The judge prided himself on being firm, unyielding, and impartial. Yet here he was, shaken by the quiet conviction of a teenager he had initially dismissed as nervous and unremarkable. The silence was finally broken by the faint creak of Harrison's chair as he leaned forward. He cleared his throat, the sound startling in the stillness. His expression remained composed, but his voice, when he spoke, lacked its usual edge. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," he said, his tone measured but softer than anyone in the courtroom had expected. "You may step down." AJ nodded, rising from the stand with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his testimony. He turned and walked back to his seat, his movements steady and deliberate. As he sat beside Ms. Carver, the lawyer gave him a brief, approving nod, her expression unreadable but her respect for AJ unmistakable. The courtroom buzzed faintly again as the spectators began to whisper among themselves. But the energy in the room had shifted. AJ's testimony had left its mark, not just on the judge but on everyone present. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed his words, their quiet power resonating far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Judge Harrison remained silent for a moment longer, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him, though it was clear his thoughts were elsewhere. For perhaps the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of his own assumptions pressing back against him. The boy who had entered his courtroom trembling with nerves had left behind a truth that was impossible to ignore. The silence, though brief, had been profound. It had carried AJ's voice farther than anyone could have anticipated. And though the trial was not yet over, one thing was clear. Alexander James Chen had changed the course of that day, not through force or anger, but with the quiet power of honesty and conviction. As Alexander James Chen returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. The air, once charged with judgment and skepticism, now buzzed with a quiet intensity, as if everyone present was processing the same unspoken thought. They had underestimated him. The silence that had followed his testimony had carried more weight than the most dramatic outburst, leaving an imprint on everyone in the room. The spectators in the gallery exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise, respect, and, in some cases, shame. A man in the back row, who had been leaning casually against the wooden bench for most of the trial, now sat upright, his arms crossed as he stared at AJ with newfound interest. A woman near the front, who had whispered doubts about AJ's sincerity earlier, now avoided eye contact with anyone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The faint murmur of conversation began to ripple through the gallery, the low hum of shifting perspectives filling the room. Ming Chen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands relaxed their grip on her jade pendant, and a faint smile spread across her lips. Her son, the boy she had watched grow under the weight of immense expectations, had stood in the face of adversity and spoken his truth with grace and courage. She felt an overwhelming sense of pride, mixed with relief, as though AJ had finally proven something, not to her, but to himself. Beside her, David Chen remained stoic, his arms crossed as he watched the judge carefully. Yet there was a subtle softening in his posture, a quiet satisfaction that spoke volumes. He glanced at Ming, their eyes meeting briefly in a shared moment of understanding. For the first time in weeks, they both allowed themselves to feel hope. Judge Richard Harrison sat motionless on the bench, his sharp eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, though it was clear his focus was elsewhere. His hands were clasped tightly, his expression unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that betrayed his thoughts. AJ's words had struck a nerve, challenging the very assumptions Harrison had made at the start of the trial. The boy's quiet resilience and heartfelt testimony had forced the judge to confront his own biases, and Harrison didn't like what he saw in himself. For a man who prided himself on control and objectivity, this moment of self-reflection was deeply uncomfortable. Harrison had expected a flustered, defensive teenager, someone who would crumble under the weight of his authority. Instead, AJ had responded with dignity, turning the tide of the courtroom in a way Harrison hadn't anticipated. The judge's silence spoke volumes, his usual air of dominance replaced by a rare moment of introspection. Across the room, Everett Winslow sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his face a mask of indignation. He adjusted his tie and whispered something sharply to his attorney, though his words were inaudible over the quiet hum of the gallery. Winslow's jaw was set, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though he could will the situation back under his control. But the damage had been done. The weight of public opinion in the room had shifted, and for the first time, Winslow seemed to sense that his narrative was no longer the dominant one. A Jay's lawyer, Ms. Carver, leaned slightly toward him, her voice low and steady. "You did well," she said, her tone carrying an unmistakable note of pride. She didn't elaborate further, but the slight nod she gave him spoke volumes. For weeks, she had worried that AJ's nerves would betray him, that he would falter under the relentless scrutiny of Judge Harrison and Winslow's attorney. But instead, he had risen to the occasion, delivering a testimony that had left the courtroom spellbound. The reporters in the back row were already scribbling furiously, their pens moving across notepads as they tried to capture the essence of what had just unfolded. One journalist, a young woman with a keen eye for human interest stories, glanced up from her notes to study AJ. There was something about him that intrigued her, something she knew would resonate with readers. She jotted down a headline idea: "Teen's Truth Shakes the Halls of Justice." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a soft wave of conversation that ebbed and flowed as spectators shared their thoughts in hushed tones. AJ's testimony had done more than shift opinions. it had humanized him in a way no one had expected. The boy they had dismissed as nervous and unprepared had revealed himself to be composed, thoughtful, and deeply principled. As the courtroom settled, A.J. allowed himself a small, steadying breath. The weight of his words still hung in the air, but he felt lighter, as though he had finally stepped out from under the shadow of doubt and fear. He glanced at his parents, their expressions a mix of pride and relief, and gave them a small, reassuring smile. For the first time, he felt as though he had truly been heard. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the quiet like the crack of a gavel. The room stilled instantly, all eyes turning back to the bench. Harrison's expression was composed, but the faint tension around his mouth betrayed the internal battle raging beneath the surface. He tapped his fingers lightly against the bench, his gaze flickering briefly toward A.J. before returning to the papers in front of him. "This court will take a brief recess," Harrison said, his voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "We will reconvene shortly." The spectators began to rise, their conversations picking up as they filed out of the courtroom. A.J. remained seated, his heart still pounding but steady. He had faced the storm, and while the trial was far from over, he felt as though a part of the battle had already been won. The reactions of those around him had shifted the atmosphere entirely, leaving the courtroom changed in a way that no one could ignore. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond the confines of the Boston Federal Courthouse. It began with a few reporters who had witnessed the trial firsthand, their articles capturing the tension and unexpected turn of events in vivid detail. The headlines varied, some dramatic, others reflective, but all carried the same central theme: a teenager's courage and composure in the face of overwhelming odds. One headline read, "Teen stands tall against wealth and power in courtroom showdown," while another declared, "Alexander James Chen, a voice for justice." The articles recounted A.J.'s testimony, his calm delivery, and the silence that had followed, painting a picture of a young man who had managed to challenge not just his accuser, but the very assumptions of the courtroom itself. In Brighton, the small suburb where A.J. and his family lived, the story ignited a wave of conversations. The community, which had initially been divided in its opinions about the case, now found itself grappling with a new perspective. Neighbors who had previously judged A.J. based on the accusations began to reconsider their views, their discussions filled with phrases like, "Did you read about what he said?" and "I had no idea he was such a thoughtful kid." At the local coffee shop, patrons huddled over their newspapers and phones, reading aloud excerpts from the articles. One older man, who had been a staunch supporter of Everett Winslow, now tapped his cane against the floor as he muttered, "Maybe we were too quick to take his side." Others nodded in agreement, their initial skepticism about A.J. replaced by a grudging respect for the boy who had refused to back down. Social media, as it always does, amplified the story further. Videos from the courtroom, posted by reporters and spectators, began to circulate online. Clips of A.J.'s testimony were shared widely, his steady voice and piercing words resonating with audiences far beyond Brighton. The hashtags number #AJChen and number Justice for A.J. started trending, with users praising his bravery and condemning the power imbalance between him and Winslow. "Teen speaks truth to power," one tweet read, accompanied by a snippet of A.J.'s closing statement. Another user shared a photo of A.J. standing at the witness stand, captioning it, "Proof that integrity still exists." In the days that followed, A.J.'s story became a flashpoint for broader conversations. Advocacy groups picked up on the narrative, using it to highlight the challenges faced by those without wealth or influence when navigating the legal system. Commentators on talk shows debated the case, some focusing on the courage it took for A.J. to stand up for himself, while others criticized the justice system for allowing a teenager to be dragged into court over what many saw as a trivial matter. For A.J., the attention was both overwhelming and surreal. He had never sought the spotlight, never imagined that his words would carry such weight beyond the courtroom walls. But now, as articles and social media posts poured in, he found himself at the center of a conversation he hadn't intended to start. At school, his classmates greeted him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Some stopped him in the hallways to say, "I saw your video. You were amazing," while others simply gave him nods of acknowledgement, their expressions betraying a newfound respect. Teachers, too, began to view him differently. Where once he had been just another overachieving student, he was now seen as someone with a quiet strength, a depth of character that few had noticed before. Meanwhile, in Brighton's Chinese-American community, AJ's story carried a deeper resonance. Families shared the articles with pride, seeing in him a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. Parents told their children about AJ's courage, using his story as a reminder of the importance of standing up for one's principles, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. At the community center where AJ had volunteered, the kids he tutored rallied around him. They had always admired him for his patience and kindness, but now they saw him as a role model in an entirely new way. "If AJ can do that," one of them said, "I can do anything." Even those who had initially sided with Winslow found themselves questioning their loyalties. The real estate mogul, once a revered figure in Brighton, now faced a wave of criticism. His decision to pursue the case against AJ was widely condemned as petty and vindictive, a stark contrast to the principles of fairness and justice that AJ had so eloquently upheld. The tide of public opinion began to shift rapidly. Letters to the editor poured into local newspapers, many of them praising AJ and denouncing Winslow's actions. Some called for a re-evaluation of the case, arguing that the justice system had failed by allowing it to reach this point in the first place. Others used AJ's story as a springboard to discuss broader issues of inequality and the need for reform. Through it all, AJ tried to stay grounded. He kept to his routine, attending school, volunteering at the community center, and spending quiet evenings with his family. Yet he couldn't ignore the way his life had changed. Strangers now recognized him on the street, their smiles and words of encouragement a reminder that his story had touched lives in ways he had never anticipated. The media and community response was not just about AJ's testimony. It was about what he represented, the quiet resilience of someone who refused to be silenced, the power of integrity in a world often dominated by power and privilege. And though AJ never sought to become a symbol, he had become one nonetheless, a reminder that even the smallest voices can echo loudly when they speak the truth. The courthouse steps were quiet as Alexander James Chen stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs with a sense of relief he hadn't felt in months. For the first time, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders since the incident seemed to lift. He paused, looking back at the towering building behind him. Inside those walls he had faced his fears, spoken his truth, and emerged intact. AJ's mind replayed the moments of the trial, not the judge's harsh words or the accusatory tone of Winslow's lawyer, but his own. He had never thought of himself as brave, but in that witness stand he had found a courage he didn't know existed. His voice, though soft at first, had carried a strength that even he hadn't anticipated. He had stood up for himself, not with anger or defiance, but with honesty and integrity. It was a moment that would stay with him forever. As he walked toward his parents, who waited for him with expressions of quiet pride, AJ couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. For weeks, he had doubted himself, letting the fear of failure gnaw at his confidence. But now, he realized something that changed the way he saw himself. He wasn't defined by the accusations against him, nor by the expectations of others. He was defined by the choices he made when it mattered most. Ming Chen wrapped her arms around him the moment he reached her, holding him tightly as though she could shield him from the harshness of the world. "You were incredible," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. David Chen placed a hand on AJ's shoulder, his usual stoicism replaced by a rare smile. "You did us proud," he said simply, but AJ could hear the depth of emotion behind those words. AJ smiled faintly, the warmth of his parents' support grounding him. But he knew that this moment wasn't just about them or even about the trial. It was about what he had learned about himself. For so long, he had felt like his life was defined by expectations, grades, achievements, a perfect future that seemed more like a blueprint than a dream. But standing in that courtroom, facing a system that had already judged him before he spoke, he had realized something greater. He wasn't just the sum of his accomplishments. He was someone who could stand tall in the face of adversity, who could choose to act with integrity even when it felt like the world was against him. That knowledge was something no grade or award could ever give him. As the family made their way to the car, AJ glanced back at the courthouse one last time. The building seemed smaller now, less imposing. It wasn't because the trial was over or because he believed he had won. It was because he had faced his fears and come out the other side stronger. In that moment, AJ knew his future wasn't about following a path someone else had laid out for him. It was about using his voice, his resilience, and his principles to shape a future he could be proud of. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he felt ready to face them, not because he was fearless, but because he had learned how to stand tall even when fear threatened to pull him down. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, AJ stared out the window, his reflection merging with the cityscape beyond. The trial had tested him in ways he had never expected, but it had also shown him who he truly was. For the first time, AJ felt not just hopeful, but confident that he could navigate whatever twists and turns life threw his way. He wasn't just a boy on trial anymore. He was someone who had found his voice, and he intended to use it. Judge Richard Harrison sat in his chambers after calling the court to recess. The familiar mahogany desk, the framed diplomas on the wall, and the neatly organized files did little to ground him. He stared at the blank legal pad in front of him, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. For the first time in years, Harrison, known for his unyielding confidence and sharp judgments, felt doubt creeping into his mind. AJ's voice echoed in his thoughts, soft yet deliberate. "I'm not perfect, Your Honor, but I believe that intent matters." The boy's words had been straightforward, unembellished, and impossible to ignore. Harrison had dismissed countless defendants in his courtroom, their excuses blending together into a dull hum of self-justification. But AJ had been different. The boy's testimony had not only silenced the courtroom but left a mark on Harrison himself. Harrison shifted in his chair, his hands clasped tightly as he replayed the events of the trial. From the moment AJ had taken the stand, Harrison had seen him as nothing more than another nervous teenager, unprepared and likely guilty of the accusations leveled against him. Harrison's sharp words, his biting sarcasm, had been intended to break AJ's composure, to force him to confront his perceived inadequacy. But instead of crumbling, AJ had done something Harrison hadn't expected. He had risen. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he rubbed his temples. He thought of the years he had spent on the bench, the countless cases that had passed through his courtroom. In his mind, he had always been a figure of authority, someone who maintained order and upheld justice without faltering. Yet, AJ's testimony had exposed something he wasn't ready to confront: his own biases. Harrison had always prided himself on his objectivity. He believed he treated every case the same, scrutinizing evidence and weighing facts without emotion. But AJ's words had stirred a memory he had long buried. Decades ago, as a young lawyer, Harrison himself had stood before a judge not unlike the man he had become, dismissive, condescending, and quick to assume the worst. He had felt the same suffocating pressure AJ must have felt, the same fear of being silenced before he had the chance to speak. Harrison had vowed then to be different, to be fair, to give everyone a voice. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that promise. The guilt settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had mocked AJ, dismissed him, and failed to see the boy's humanity until it was laid bare in front of him. Harrison's hands tightened into fists, the realization cutting deep. He had allowed his impatience, his assumptions, and his own insecurities to cloud his judgment. AJ's words about intent struck a nerve. Harrison had always believed in the power of action over excuses, but AJ had made him question whether he had been too rigid in that belief. Was it possible that he had been so focused on maintaining control that he had lost sight of the truth? Had his need for authority blinded him to the nuances of the human stories unfolding in his courtroom? The judge rose from his chair and began pacing the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He thought of AJ's parents sitting in the gallery, their faces etched with equal parts fear and pride. He thought of the boy himself, standing alone in the witness box speaking with a quiet strength that had silenced a room filled with skeptics. And he thought of his own words, the harsh tones and sarcastic jabs that now felt hollow and mean-spirited. For the first time in years, Harrison felt a pang of shame. He had failed not just AJ, but the very principles he claimed to uphold. Justice, he realized, was not just about enforcing the law. It was about listening, about understanding the context behind the actions, and about giving every person the chance to be seen and heard. Somewhere along the way, Harrison had stopped listening. Empathy, in particular, emerged as a glaring absence in the early stages of AJ's trial. Judge Harrison's initial approach reflected an over-reliance on authority and a lack of consideration for the human being standing before him. This mirrors a broader societal issue where individuals in positions of power often prioritize efficiency and control over fairness and understanding. But AJ's words pierced through these assumptions, forcing the judge, and by extension, the audience, to confront the humanity behind the case. This incident underscores the importance of pausing to listen, to see beyond what is immediately visible, and to acknowledge the stories that lie beneath the surface. AJ's ability to articulate his intent and principles revealed not just his own character, but the fault lines in a system and society that too often dismisses the voices of the vulnerable. The societal lesson here is clear. Respect is not just a courtesy, but a foundational element of justice and fairness. Empathy bridges the gap between judgment and understanding, creating a world where people are valued for their humanity rather than judged by their circumstances. AJ's journey reminds us that the way we treat others, whether in a courtroom, a workplace, or a community, has the power to define not just their experience, but our collective values. In every pivotal moment of AJ's story, courage played a central role. It was not the loud, dramatic bravery of heroes in movies, but a quiet, deliberate strength born of necessity. AJ's bravery was not about proving others wrong, but about standing firm in the truth, even when the odds were stacked against him. Walking into that courtroom, AJ knew he was facing more than a legal battle. He was up against a powerful accuser, a skeptical audience, and a judge who had made his bias clear. The easier path would have been to shrink under the pressure, to let his nerves define him, or to give up and accept a narrative that wasn't his own. But AJ chose a different path. He found his voice and used it to speak his truth with dignity and clarity. This courage, though subtle, was transformative. It silenced a room that had expected him to crumble. It challenged the assumptions of a judge who had seen countless cases but rarely stopped to question his own approach. And it inspired a community to reconsider how they viewed justice, integrity, and accountability. AJ's bravery also serves as a lesson for anyone who has ever felt underestimated or unheard. It shows that courage does not require certainty or fearlessness. It requires a willingness to act despite the fear. By standing up for himself, AJ not only defended his own integrity, but also reminded others of the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. His actions demonstrate that courage is contagious. It has the power to shift perceptions, ignite conversations, and plant seeds of change in even the most rigid systems. AJ's story is a testament to the idea that bravery, no matter how quiet or understated, can leave an indelible mark on those who witness it. As AJ's story draws to a close, It leaves behind a trail of lessons that extend far beyond the walls of the courtroom. His journey is a reminder of the resilience that exists within all of us and the profound impact of standing up for what is right, even when the world seems to doubt us. For Judge Harrison, AJ's testimony marked a moment of reckoning, a pause in the relentless machinery of authority that forced him to reflect on his own biases and behavior. Whether the judge's introspection leads to lasting change remains uncertain, but the moment itself was significant. It showed that even those who seem immovable are not beyond the reach of humility and growth. For the community, AJ's courage sparked important conversations about fairness, justice, and the power dynamics that often shape them. It reminded people that justice is not just about the law, but about the humanity that underpins it. The incident highlighted the role of collective support in challenging systemic issues, proving that change begins with individuals willing to speak out. For AJ, the experience was transformative. He emerged not just as a boy who defended himself, but as a symbol of quiet strength and integrity. He learned that his voice, though small in the grand scheme of things, carried the power to shift perspectives and inspire others. The trial did not just test his character, it revealed it. As AJ walked out of the courthouse that day, he carried with him a lesson that will resonate for the rest of his life. Courage and truth are their own rewards. They may not always guarantee immediate victory, but they have the power to create ripples that grow into waves of change. In reflecting on AJ's story, we are reminded to examine our own lives. How often do we judge others without understanding them? How many opportunities do we miss to show empathy or to stand up for what is right? AJ's journey challenges us to pause, to listen, and to act with compassion and integrity. The courtroom may have fallen silent that day, but the echoes of AJ's courage will continue to resonate, urging each of us to find our own voice in the face of adversity and to use it to create a more just and empathetic world.